Alright, let's go over a few timeline tips you'll want to keep in mind while working. First, when you're labeling your timeline, or anything for that matter, I strongly recommend against using all caps. Using all capital letters results in a decreased contrast in letter size and shape, making text a bit harder to read. Just something to keep in mind as you set up your timeline and your projects in general. Next, you'll want to decide very early in a project how you'll be working with stereo versus mono tracks. We talked about this already in the audio track section, but it bears repeating. Some editing programs will allow you to place media on any track. For example, Adobe Premiere allows you to move a piece of single-channel mono audio from a mono track to a stereo track and vice versa. This is great and super flexible. You don't have to worry too much if that's how your software functions. Other programs, like Avid Media Composer for example, will only allow you to place mono media on mono tracks and stereo media on stereo tracks. That means you'll need to have a plan from the very beginning, which tracks will contain which type of audio. Splitting stereo tracks into dual mono tracks later on down the road is going to create a lot of confusion. And at least in current versions of the software, there's no good way of going from dual mono tracks back to a single stereo. As a general rule in Avid, I'd recommend considering working with your music in stereo tracks and keeping all your other tracks mono for maximum flexibility. Third, you'll want to keep the graveyard clean. What's the graveyard? Well, it's where the footage and the audio go to die. Specifically, it's the space at the end of your timeline, where editors will often put extra shots and dialogue while working, maybe some various attempts at different sections of the cut, and any other piece of media that doesn't necessarily have a home in the final piece. This area of the timeline can tend to get a bit crowded and cause a number of problems. For one, it adds to the file size of your sequence, and is a drain on your system's resources. This might not seem like a big deal at first, but when you're on version 42 of something, and you've duplicated the sequence each time with all its extra graveyard media, things start to get out of control pretty fast. And second, graveyard media can get confusing for other editors and assistants who need to work with your cut. It's not hard to imagine someone unfamiliar with your cut needing to output a QuickTime, marking an in to an out across your whole timeline, and accidentally exporting an extra 20 minutes of junk. Fourth, keep in mind that you can always add more tracks as needed. For example, in our timeline template, we allocate 2 tracks for cutting your stereo music. But at some point, you might find yourself working with the instrumental stems of a cue, meaning you'll have a track of percussion, a track of guitar, and so on. In this scenario, you'd be getting into some pretty heavy-duty music editing to really customize it to perfectly fit your cut, in the absence of a dedicated composer for the project. In this case, you're going to need a lot more music tracks. Feel free to add them. The same goes for sound design. If you're cutting something that needs more than the 8 tracks that we've dedicated to effects, add a few more and bump everything else down. On the flip side, try not to add more tracks than you actually need. You want to be able to fit all your tracks on your monitor without having to scroll up and down to see them all. I like to put my entire timeline full screen on a dedicated second monitor. This brings us to track size. Adjust the track size based on its specific editing function. So what does that mean? Essentially, the more fine editing you'll be doing with the track, the bigger it should be. Make your audio tracks a bit larger than your video tracks. And with your audio tracks, give a little bit more room to dialogue and music than sound effects. Now, this primarily applies if you choose to work with waveforms for your audio editing, where you'll want to see the syllables in the dialogue and the beats in the music. Also, don't be afraid to expand a track to be huge if you really need to do some detail work. You'd be surprised at how many editors try to finesse a cut without really being able to see what they're actually doing. Alright, so that pretty much wraps up our timeline module. Now that we've got a good plan for organizing and working with our tracks and media, it's time to go a bit deeper into the editing process. Coming up in the next module, we'll be jumping into the world of dialogue editing, beginning with some rules for working with different audio sources. Alright, I'll see you in a bit.